buildings. They're little small foreground buildings. You remember in the last lecture I talked about these background buildings and foreground buildings. These are four foreground buildings that are contemporary ones, and they're all in Scandinavia. 3 are in Finland and 1's in Sweden. 2, I think, are many layered and textured in a way that roots them profoundly. And they give a good idea of the kind of human scale approach I'm looking for. And the other 2 represent the more prevalent approach today, which aims at a uniqueness of form. The idea of the textured architecture comes out of having visited that part of the world for, I think, the 3rd time. And I suddenly realized that both countries, particularly Finland, are quite flattish, geographically quite undistinguished. Large areas of them are. Anyway, I don't know actually Sweden at all well, but we've traveled quite extensively around Finland, quite flattish. And the experience of the country is of forests and forests and lakes, all texture. Sorry, these are the 4 buildings that we're going to look at. St. Mark's Church in Stockholm by Leverance, the Vuxeniska Church, it's the Church of 3 Crosses by Aalto Nimatra, the Kiasma Museum in Helsinki by Stephen Holmes, an American architect, and a library in a little place called Seinäjoki, which is in the middle of Finland, by a firm called JKMM, which I don't really know very much about the firm, so those are them. And there's the texture, typical texture of Sweden and Finland, particularly Finland. There are these protrusions of granite that are quite prominent around the country that you see, but very, very seldom do you see anything like the drama of a Drakensberg wall or Cederberg or anything like that. It's really a very mild, modest kind of a landscape. And it's much more around the textures that there are in the forests. It's a little bit like a kind of a forested version of the Karoo, if one can imagine something like that, that you sort of have to really get into it to learn about its beauty. It's not something that you can just drive past and admire. Very deeply layered, deeply textured. And there's absolutely typical, the sort of dappled water and the leaves and the foliage of the bushes and the light coming through, and often not very much light. And then if you look at the old architecture there, it's also very textured, not really so much about form, but much more about texture. There's a little old, a rather beautifully restored town. And it's all just texture. Just look at the roadway with its differences of cobbles and the buildings with small pieces of timber, making these patterns, textured patterns. Old churches, very, very different from plastered churches or brick and stone churches. It's really very, very much around patterns of different kinds of texture. So that was the kind of feeling I had about. I suddenly had this feeling, this place is all texture, and then we were visiting buildings mainly by Leverance and Aalto, or particularly Aalto. And I suddenly felt that these buildings were also textured, that they were very layered buildings. That was different from buildings that were aiming to be formal explorations. They were much more buildings that you needed to come quite close to and explore in all sorts of ways through their different layers. So I'm going to go through those layers with these buildings now. And this is the first one, which is the St. Mark's Church by Leverance in Stockholm. And I'm starting with looking at what I call the layer of the site, the first sort of layer, how the building sits on the site. And you can see that as you approach it, there's this sort of slight rise up to this quite blocky sort of brick building, and you can see on the right-hand side of the brick building a kind of a curved element, and the walkway takes you up to that. The site is, as it looks here, rather undistinguished, slight modulations in it. It's more or less in a wood, and around the edges of the wood, a smallish wood, and around the edges of the wood there's fairly high density housing. So you come up to that round tower, which you can just get a glimpse of on the left-hand slide, and then the walkway goes down into this courtyard and down to the entrance of the church, left into the courtyard and right into the church. And both of them, it goes down to those spaces. Now, you remember when I was talking about the power relations of going down and going up, you can see that with both of these, the first sensation that you have when you go into this place is that you kind of go down and the building meets you on equal terms. It doesn't try and dominate you in any kind of a way. If you look at the way the building works across the site, this is on the site that you enter from, and there's this kind of rather low wall of building, and the scale of the building changes as it goes across this rather gentle slope in I think very subtle ways that talks to you about the way the building is used. So this is this mild kind of continuous scale of the kind of administrative areas of it, and then you come around that tower element in the corner where it gets a kind of much bigger scale as you come into the courtyard. And the courtyard, which is used for all sorts of things of quite little scale, like mothers' meetings, and they run a creche there and so on during the week, comes down to this very intimate scale. And on the other side of that, there's the church, which is at the lowest part of the site. And I think the building very subtly takes that up with the highest part of the building. So you get a sense of almost grandeur at this part of the site. So there's this very subtle way of the building settling into the site, taking up the levels in a very subtle way, and creating different qualities of scale as you move through it. The layer of history. If you first look at that, it just looks like a modern building. I don't know whether you agree, but I think it does. To be a bit clearer about it, it was a building that was built in the late 50s, and it looks very much like what was called Swedish New Empiricism, which was a kind of movement that happened particularly in Sweden during and just after the Second World War, which was really aimed to try and humanize modernism a bit and make it work technically better. So the first glance of it seems to fit very comfortably in that, and it doesn't seem to have any allusion to historical things. But if you think about it for a while and spend a little time, it quite obviously does connect up with historical churches like these ones in Ravenna, that kind of mixture of cylindrical towers and square buttress forms. That curvy corner that we came around on entering the building on the right is also obviously alluding to these very commonly found attached rounded corners in Swedish and Finnish kind of manor houses. The way the building is built in detail, it's built to suggest that it's been built over time, that changes have been made in the process, so it gets this kind of archaic, slightly ruin-like quality in the making of it, the sense of time in it. And when you go into the church, it's immediately recognizable as a place of worship of a particular kind that belongs to the conventions of some of the main conventions of making these kind of spaces, with its sort of double a double nave, a main nave and a smaller one on the side. Very recognizable. And the quality of light and the use of a lot of reflected light and then these dashes of brilliant light is also very reminiscent, and in that sense closely related to historical churches like this one. It's a wonderful old Romanesque church in France, Saint Philibert, which has got a very similar kind of atmosphere. So he's clearly, to use the terms that we talked about yesterday, he's alluding to the history of the making of Christian religious spaces. The Lair of Nature. If you look at the way the building's built, if you look at the bricks, every brick seems to be handled as an individual. You can see they're all a family of bricks, but each one has got its slight differences that, with this very broad jointing system that he used, seems to bring it out. So if you look at the bricks and you look at the leaves on the trees, and this is not a very good photo for looking at the bark on the trees, also they, in a sense, I think they all seem to be made by the same hand. It's as if the bricks are sort of nature in the same way of the nature that the leaves are of. And then he uses natural materials in very authentic ways. So timber is used, obviously unpainted as timber. Metal elements are shown to be, and the detailing is made in a way that sort of shows how it's worked and bent, and then all over this this powerful pattern of the brickwork. In this part of the world, there's very little light for a lot of the year. I always love the story that they told us of the cattle that get locked up when it starts to get cold, and they get put in sheds, cattle sheds, and they're kept there for, 5 months of the year when it's too cold to let them out. And when they get out, these huge big cows and bulls spring around the field like little creatures, because they're so pleased to see some light and a freshness of spring. So in a place where there's for a lot of the year very little light, I think light in this building is treated like something very, very precious. And if you look at the way that these curved surfaces, you get these beautiful, softly molded, graded bands of light in the building. This is also a good photograph to show the relationship between the bark on the trees and the bricks on the building. It's all part of the same pattern of things. And then right through the building, light is exploited in ways like this. So these sharp shadows of light and shafts of light. And inside, lots of reflected light, and again these dashes of very bright light. The tectonic layer, in other words, the layer that talks about the way the building is built. The basic forms, these rounded forms, the mixture of rounded towers and square towers is quite clearly around stability, isn't it? If you want to make a tall brick wall be stable, you make it round. You can visualize that. You can stand a bottle up, but you can't stand a book up. The bottle stands by itself because of its roundness. And so I think in the actual form of the building, it talks quite a lot about that sort of sense of stability. And then he does things like, well, you can see the edge of the thickness of the wall. He makes it look very thick, and then serrates it in this way that draws, that emphasizes that. Even the way that I'm just noticing it now really, the way the bell is held with that kind of bracket that comes over, you get a very good sense of the way in which that bracket helps to stabilize that wall. So right through, there's the building's talking about its stability. When you come to openings, there's always a stress on the depth of the wall at the opening. And then every element in the building is made in a way that shows you how it was built. So if you look at the doorways, both doorways, they're obviously different, and they're handled for their own particular place and circumstance. But you can see in both of them that whatever is interesting about the door, you might not like the door, but whatever is interesting about it is that it's put together in a way that it talks to you about how it was made. And the same goes for the little handrail, and the same goes for the steps, and the same goes for the gutter, and so on. Every element is like that. So when you bring water off the roof, it's done in a way that you get a good sense of how it's put together and what it's all composed of. And then this is part of the entrance to the church hall, you can see how he's working with building kind of new motifs, new tectonic motifs, new ways of holding things up with pieces of timber that talk about the way it's held up, just in the same or in similar ways to the Japanese ones that we were looking at. The roof construction in the church itself and also in the hall, they're both very much part of the making of the significance of the building, and the acoustic treatment in the hall is much more than just acoustic treatment. Here you can see the Somo acoustic treatment at the back, but in this building, in the hall, the acoustic treatment becomes part of that sort of bunch of different rhythms of the different layers that run through the building. And then, of course, the bricks. Again, when I was talking about when you see a piece of work close by and you get a sense of the making of it, I think you'll agree with me that when you look at brickwork like that, you almost get a feeling of the bricks being laid, the mortar scraped away, the tamping into position. All those qualities of the brickwork affect your neurons, affect your body in a certain way. And that runs very consistently through the building. The next layer I call a kind of time layer or process layer. And that comes out of the sense of incompleteness in the building. It's actually not so much a building, but a whole little group of buildings, like a village almost. And there's a feeling that it's not quite finished yet, that it's built up in layers, which I think is quite clear in this. Interestingly, it's actually all based geometrically on the golden mean, so it's quite strictly controlled. But the impression of it is certainly that it's like a village. So if you look at a model of it, it's quite difficult to imagine somebody sitting at a board and drawing that, because it looks to me, I don't know what you feel of it. It looks to me like a whole lot of people have made a whole lot of decisions about this building, as if somebody decided to, or started with something there and added a bit on there, and then there's that little bit that goes around the corner with those sort of snouts that stick out the roof of it. It seems put together in very much the same kind of way, in an incremental way, like a bit of city. And when you look at the close-up of the building itself, on the left-hand side, it's actually built like that. So when two of the pieces of those pieces come together, there's a kind of little gap, almost as if, can you see the little gap? Almost as if it's been built at a different time. And then there are these details like the ones on the right-hand side where you can't imagine again somebody that's part of a preconception. It's much more like a series of details that are worked out in the process of building the building. So there's a kind of a feeling that the whole lot of people have made decisions about the building and the way that it's put together. The layer of human purpose. The spaces in the building are, in my view, closely related to the kind of purposes that are going to be there. So you have these rather low, intimate spaces with a slight low vaults where the creche children are, and that actually also runs into the area where you the sort of coats area, whereas the hall, different from that, has a much more general kind of a light and with different materials and a very warm kind of feeling about it. The church, on the other hand, has got this rather severe quality with these patches of brilliance that come into it. And when you look at that from the outside, it's like a whole collection of volumes that get put together. I often think about buildings like this as a bit like a pool in the sea, where you get anemones and all sorts of creatures that sort of end up in the same pool, and they all push up against each other and gradually find an appropriate kind of way of being together. To me, it's got that kind of quality about it, which is also a bit like the way that a city is made. And that affects your experience of the building as you move around. So the floor changes, you feel the floor changes under your feet, because all the time the paving is shifting from one kind of paving to the other. The materials on the walls are textured differently, so sounds sound differently in different parts of the building as you move through. So it's very, very richly layered building. Right, that's our first building. The second one, the Vuksaniska Church of Alto. I'm not sure that it's the best Alto building to have chosen. I think it would probably have been better to use just a civic centre, which we'll see some of tomorrow. But anyway, I think it nevertheless shows the same kind of ideas. Just a plan of it, not a particularly good plan, but I think you can see how it works. The approaches all come from the lower part, basically from the left-hand side, from the road. Again, it's in a kind of semi-rural area, and you come into a sort of space between the art building and the church. Not a very powerfully made space, but nevertheless a space. And then there are these three main entrances of the three arrows that point vertically upward, or the most commonly used ones. The one on the right-hand side is for big occasions, and the one on the left is really a kind of a secondary entrance. So that roughly is how it works. It sits on, again, rather flattish land on the edge of a forest, again, very typically. And you approach it down. This is from on the left of the previous slide, down very slight slope to the church building. And it stretches it out, pieces of it stretch out, so it's immediately comes out to reach you. It's not a singular one thing, but something that's a hierarchy of forms where the lower ones come out to meet you in various ways. And you find yourself entering between, as I said, those two buildings in a space, in this space here. I've moved very quickly from the layer of the site in that previous description to the layer of history. And this making a space of a group of buildings is something that comes also very much out of Finnish history. So if you look at a typical traditional farmstead in the top left-hand corner, you get a cluster of buildings like that around a little space. And Alto, in almost all his work, uses that, whether it's with his holiday house or his own office, or with quite a big institute building in the middle of Helsinki. There's this space in the middle of the building. So it's not a building, but it's a group of buildings around a space. And I think that's already quite significant historically, but also in making a good relationship with the site. And when you first look at the building on the left, you think, well, it's quite a strange form and it's quite unusual, but it's, again, if you pause for a moment, you can quite quickly see how it's part of a tradition of making these sort of rather white, pale buildings in forests in that part of the world. The one on the right is actually in Russia, but there are many similar ones in Sweden and Finland. And even this rather odd carapace roof, it's like a shell of some sort of animal that comes over and comes down to quite low in the building, which looks like something completely out of history and quite strange. But if you look at old churches, they have the same kind of a roof, this big roof that comes down like a tortoise and comes down to quite low on the building. And again, the separation of the tower and the church is clearly relating to that kind of history. The Lair of Nature. I mean, looking at the building, you'd think that it wouldn't have any relationship with nature, other than that it's kind of curvy, so I suppose you could call it organic. It would fit with hills and things. But I feel fairly sure that form comes out of these granite protrusions that you get all over Sweden and Finland. They apparently are from the previous ice age, the melting of the ice. As the ice moved backwards, it's rounded these pieces of granite in this sort of rounded, serrated way. So, and many of Aalto's buildings have got that slight serrations in them. So this sort of rounded, serrated quality, I think, quite clearly relates to that. And again, it's clearly about light and catching the light in all kinds of interesting ways. Not just randomly, but obviously also bringing light to places where you want it to come. And then we're talking about the Lair of Nature. The windows obviously refer to the forests. They are metaphors of the forests. So as you move through the building, you're constantly aware of the environment that it's in. Tectonic layer. I wouldn't say that as a building as a whole, it sort of talks about its construction or its permanence and so on very particularly. It's made in a kind of a double, it's like a double skin. It's like a shell-like building with an outer shell that deals with the weather and the sun and those sort of things, and an inner shell that's shaped, if you like, to make the places of worship. And you often experience that double shell structure, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there. You experience the thickness, the depth of that shell, and that obviously has also got it talks about structural stability and insulation. It has got these columns that run through the church, and they're always handled with significance, particularly around dividing the church into the three pieces that it is divided into. They're big and rounded and clearly part of showing and talking about the stable quality of the building. And then the layer of human purpose. In these early sketches, you can see the idea of the building, that it was to be divided into three pieces. And I'll just go immediately to the next one, which is the plan now. And you can see there are three pieces. And it's a fantastic plan because the church hasn't got a hall, but with those three entrances coming from the bottom there, each entrance has got a little entrance space, and there are big doors that you can pull out that close between those rounded columns. Maybe I should just point that out to you if I can. If I can do that. See, these columns here, there are big doors that come from there, and they close to there, and from there to there. So you can come in here, and you can use this space independently of these two. And in fact, when I went there many years ago and arrived, there was a little service going on here There was a teenagers playing table tennis there, and I can't remember what was going on there, but there were 3 different things going on in the place at the same time. Or you can open it all up so that if you have a big funeral or marriage, wedding or something like that, you can all come in that door and you use it as a totality. And there you can see how it works in the cross section. Each one has got its own individual rounded interior space, but they're also all linked together. So the form of it is, although it's got this strong sculptural form, it's clearly very closely related to an idea of human occupation, human purpose. And then the way it's made in detail is all the time looking to make things soft to the touch, soft and warm, and the light is manipulated in ways that creates these sort of delicate body pearl-like kind of interior qualities. And it is all white inside, but the warm color of the floors and the pews reflects a little bit, so you get a soft golden light that goes through the whole building. The layer of process and time. Again, if you look at the way that building is put together there, it's quite difficult to imagine somebody planning that and drawing it up and doing it. It looks to me much more like decisions taken over time. It's got a kind of circumstantial feeling about it, as if it's grown by degrees. And I actually wonder whether it didn't take a long time to design, so the architect did in fact work it through and through and through, pushing it this way and that, rather than it coming out of a momentary conception. And again, these kind of circumstantial details that must have been worked out on the site rather than in an office. So it's very much like the previous building, a kind of hands-on in the process of building kind of building, rather than something that's preconceived in an office and then put together on the site. And like, again, the previous one, there's so many variations of particular things. So each door and each window seems to be looked after individually. It's almost like working with with expressions on somebody's face or something, the lines on their face to develop the character of the building. Sorry, I won't be able to catch up to where I am. Right, this is the Chiasma Museum in Helsinki, of Stephen Holz. And I think this little conceptual sketch again is very interesting because it shows the building, which is there, and its relationship with the things around it. And if you look up the website, there's something. It uses the term a cultural curve, and it's referring to this curve of this building over here that comes and somehow gets taken up in that building. It's in quite a prominent position. There's a lake here that's sort of gradually being improved and extended and is intended to be brought in that direction. This is the Parliament building that's sort of right here, and you can see from the sketch that he visualized a relationship between the Parliament building and that comes across here and into that space, which is right in front of the art gallery, which is over there. Here there's a road that comes, which seems to be closed by that. Now, when you actually get there, none of that works. It's just not like that at all. So it's quite a funny feeling. This is standing at that Parliament building, and you can see that there's no ways it has any relationship whatsoever with that space in front of the Chiasma Museum. And the road that comes next to it also doesn't come into the building, it goes right past it, so the building doesn't close the road. So it's quite an odd feeling you have of like slightly spurious kind of putting something onto the site where it's actually not doing what you what you say it's going to be doing or should be doing. And with the cultural curve is talking about the Finlandia building, which is an old alto building, which is at least half a kilometer away. And the curves there are basically to accommodate these rather beautiful old trees. That's what generated the curves. Whereas if you think of the image of the Kiasma Museum, it's quite a different kind of curve. So for me, there's a lot of things that I immediately start to feel a bit worried about in thinking about the siting of the building and the way that it relates to the buildings around it. If you come at it from other directions, and the top left-hand one is the main entrance, and there indeed there is a piece of threshold space where an element sort of pulls out and gives some shelter over the entrance. From the other direction, there are these two sort of roads that come at it, and in both of them you get presented with the building end on very much as an object, and on the lower one you come at it very obliquely. It's very rude in my view, on this side of the building, where it sort of turns its back really to what is a very busy pedestrian route. It's not on this day because this was a Sunday afternoon or something, but we've been there when there's been absolutely full of people coming up and down, shops on the left, and all those bicycle places all full of bicycles. So it's a very busy route that threads up through the city, and basically the building sort of turns its back, well, one could say it puts its bum at the back there like that. So that's the back of the building. But you know, it's the back of the building, but it's on the other side of it there's shops. So it's sort of, so I'm saying that in its siting, it's doing things that are sort of quite rude to buildings around it. The Lair of Nature, it's sort of difficult to sort of think about it connecting with any aspect of nature. It clearly doesn't connect with the climate in any way or with natural forms. The closest I can sort of get to it is with the way that it's working with water. And it has this, you can see in the plan, there's a pool that runs across the front of the building that's on the same side as the parliamentary building, and then it goes through a kind of cascade through the building to a pool that's at the back that was going to connect into that lake. Now, if you look at the top slide, you can't see the water. You know, all the opportunities that water have for connecting buildings to a broader environment, he misses because it's at a height where you can't even see it. And then when you get to where you can see it in the lower right-hand side, which is right up against the building itself, and you're looking again for sort of reflective possibilities, the building itself doesn't offer very much to reflect. So I think it doesn't do too well there. And here you can see that on the plan, it seems such a dramatic idea to bring that water through the building and connect it to this pool at the back. Where it goes through the building, it's rather gloomy. So the cascades that go down there aren't bouncing with lovely light that's putting, casting light all around you or anything like that, because there's no light that falls onto it. So it's quite gloomy. And when you look at the little pool, it seems really pointless. So I think there's lots of gesturing in the building about making connections, if you like, with nature, which are not really working at all. The layer of history, again, it's clearly a building that's not referring to long past history. It's probably referring in certain ways to more contemporary things with very lightweight materials, and things like the way that window is made obviously connects to something in neoplasticism, but generally I would say it's a much more self-referential building. When you go into the inside of it, it seems to be much more a place that gives you novel effects, novel experiences, rather than something that is alluding to anything historical. So I wouldn't say that it has any or very little historical allusion. It's rather a much more kind of self-referential building. Pardon? The date of it? It's about 1985, something like that. I'm getting in a muddle now, but anyway. Inside, the main feature of the interior really is these very sculptural elements and sculptural walkways and connections and stairs. It's quite curious. After a while, I sort of had a feeling of that they got a bit dull. There seemed to be something a little bit pointless about them, a bit one-dimensional. There are very interesting connections from the building outwards to there. You can see the parliamentary building in the background. If you want to look at things close to your hands, look at the railings and so on around there. I think are not very humane at all. And there's some spaces in the building, and this is really talking about human purpose, that with the movement areas, it's obviously around reflecting your movement as you go around and giving an experience of that. And then with the other areas, some of them I think are really quite tawdry, like the restaurant area. It looks to me like sort of any little railway station restaurant anywhere, rather horrid in fact, quite surprisingly horrid. The gallery spaces, for instance, talking about human purpose, I think some of them are very poor. For instance, the top left-hand one, where you have light behind you and you're looking at something at the wall in front of it with your back to the light, so your shadow casts on the thing that you want to look at. It's really hopeless for a gallery situation. It's the last thing that you would want to do, and you can see the top right, it does the same sort of thing there. They're not all like that. Some of them are much better, like the one on the left, and then there's this rather dramatic and beautiful space up on the top that reflects that curvy roof, which I think is quite a stunning space. The Tectonic Layer, it's a very interesting building, I think, structurally. It's like this big cantilever that curves up and then it's tied down on the one side. And that shelters a whole lot of very light floors that build up like tables underneath it. And that's, I think, very cleverly expressed on the end, the sort of feeling of those light sheaths below this tree-like kind of big major structure. That's what it's in section, and that space that we were looking at, the one up in the top, is that space there. We were in that space over there. I do feel that the building as a whole misses out on a big opportunity of talking about its structure, that that a lot of these floors, they simply crash into the curving main structure, so you never get the feeling of this whole structure around you, which I think is a great opportunity that's really missed in it. You get closest to it in those walkways, but you're sort of distracted by the sculptural quality, and you get very little sense of the whole embracing overall structure. I must try and find my place now. I'm sorry, I've got in a muddle. Why I got in such a muddle? Okay. Right. the library at Senajoki. The library is where the red arrow is pointing fairly obviously, and it was a development that was all planned by Alvar Aalto in this little town. So the town hall is an Aalto building, the existing library is Aalto, that's a kind of little conference, and a concert hall of Aaltos, and here there's an Aalto church which has got a kind of little amphitheatre here that you can see connects across there, and this is the main space. Now, where I think, if one's talking about the layer of the site, that I've got real problems is that what they decided with this new library is that they weren't going to connect with the old one other than underground. So there's a sort of underground connection here, but they've made in completely new entrances, which is there, which means that the entrance to the existing library, which is here, gets closed. So all the activity that would have brought to here gets lost. And it really reduces the quality of this space, and all the activity ends up being over there, which is kind of out of the main drag, which I think was it was just such a pity, and it was very unnecessary to do it, because Aalto works, as you see, also with very strong forms, but he always has a big form and then he has an ordinary one, and the ordinary ones are very easy to extend and to add onto. So this building could very easily have used this lower form to do the ordinary bit and make the proper space, and then maybe there's a more dramatic thing that happens behind it. Whereas here, what this arrangement has made is that you get an island building and an island building, and this one has got no entrances. I mean, in the town square, to me, that's like really crazy. This building, incidentally, was won in a competition all over Finland. Well, it was an international competition won by this Finnish firm. So that's its main location. It does make reference to Aalto's church tower. You can see with this line that goes straight to it. But it's really much more a visual abstract connection rather than, proper one of human activity and so on. And you can see that that is a little escape stair that goes to the underground passage that connects this building to that, which is Aalto's old library, the old library that got too small for the town group too quickly. If one looks for a layer of human purpose and you look at the plan, you can only say, well, there was no human purpose in the plan. It's like an abstract. It's an abstract form that all the accommodation has been pushed into, and a lot of it, I think, is done surprisingly well. So that goes for all of these buildings. There's a lot that I admire in these architects of their abilities. I'm certainly not talking about a lack of ability. I'm talking about wrong-headedness. So there are a couple of horrors here. This space is a computer workspace, that one there, and then there's a little auditorium space, a bit like this, that kind of looks into also looks into a corner. So those are quite odd things that happen around fitting human purpose into such a formalistic, abstract shape. One of the problems that it has that also comes out of that formalistic shape is that it's got nothing to do with bringing light into a library. I mean, a library, one of the main things surely must be to have a good quality of reading, natural reading light, so you can sit there the whole day with as much as you can with natural light. Whereas here, as you can see, in the reading area, in the bookstack area, you have this huge window at one end of the space. That can't be a good way of making a space for a library. This is the edge of the, we're looking over the edge of this little kind of auditorium space and up to where you enter from. So, okay, so in terms of human purpose, there's that auditorium's not the right space. What do you call it? Sort of arena, little arena space that looks into this sharp corner, and that's that computer room that comes to in a very tight triangle. I mean, it's a really horrible space to work in, I think. It's certainly not related to human purpose in any good way. And I think as you go through the building, you get more and more the feeling that it's much more around creating these sort of rather amazing illusionistic spaces. It's not a horrid place to visit at all. It's a very interesting place to visit because it has spaces like this where it suddenly all becomes all white, and you get this funny kind of illusionary sense, and this one too, and here you get these odd places where you're really not quite sure where you are in the building or what's happening in it, because they've worked very skillfully with the geometries of it to create these sort of like tricks, or spatial tricks. So this is where you see the people walking along the end. There is where you come in. There you enter along from there, from the entrance, and then down into the main reading and stack area, and then this goes down, and this is the space that connects across to the existing library. And when you look through into there, you go into the children's section, and that's where I think it really works much better, because the whole scale changes from this rather tall space to a much lower space, and then that reduces again, where he has these kind of little boxes of space that kids can go into, which is, I think, it's a pretty good idea, and seems to work very well in many ways, although I'm not too fond of the materials and so on that are used there. And he creates a lot of these little illusionistic spaces for kids to be in, which are quite fun, but to me they're a little bit kind of on the cosmetic side rather than being kind of rooted. If one looks at the Lair of Nature, again, as with the previous building, it's quite difficult to connect it with the natural world there, other than it's when you look at it in the snow, which we didn't, it's not my photograph there, and the one and the below, it does seem to have a kind of crackly, icy kind of feeling about it. Structurally, it's actually very interesting because it uses this folded plate concrete system, which you can get these tremendously long spans with, and that's part of the creating of illusions of the space like that. So it's sort of incredibly wide space that's got no support. It's like, look, mummy, no hands kind of. It's showing off a little bit, I think, with the structure, and in a way it's also missing out on all those depths and qualities that you get when you get columns that come down into space that make smaller space and subspaces and so on. Was, again, I think I find this rather one-dimensional. You can see that it's not aiming to talk about structure, because it keeps abstracting it. So you just have a pattern that's just painted on part of the roof, or not, or you clad it with some sort of white materials and so on. So it's much more, making a little box of tricks than creating a series of, more lasting human experiences. And structurally, it's really much more around making these powerful abstract forms, which I must say you need a pretty wide-angle camera and very special light to produce these photographs. So, yeah. Okay, so if I can just try and summarize that a little bit. We've been looking at buildings which represent very different approaches. The first two settle modestly into their site. They convey a sense of adjustment over time to the vagaries of different needs and minds, and they make space for future adjustments. They communicate in all kinds of ways, reflecting on the traditions of their place and other places, referring to the local landscape, embracing human action, engaging with elemental needs of stability and shelter, and treating every human experience with respect and elevating it. And the second two dominate the space of their sites. They present themselves as complete and unique objects